Okay. I'm sorry, I need my glasses to keep my hair out of my face. I don't know why my hair dried this way. I tried, I promise. Okay. So this is going to be pretty brief. I'm just decided to go over the master-servant relationship a little bit because there is a little bit more of analysis. I feel like I'm not breaking it down as intense as I did for the sales video, but I'm a little worried about my love of my life because he's so sick. So if that is affecting this, I apologize. Let me know what I'm missing. So master-servant relationship, I don't really like the name. Very old doctrine. You can think of it more like employer-employee relationship because that's what it is. So when you're looking to see whether an employer can be held liable for the acts of the employee, you have to ask yourself a few questions. First, in the scope of what is happening in the fact pattern, who is benefiting from the work that is getting done? If it is the employee who is benefiting, then it's probably an independent contractor, this would not apply. But if the person that's benefiting is the employer, then that kind of leans more towards the fact that this is going to be a master-servant relationship. Second question is to ask yourself what the manner of the work is, meaning who controls how the work is done and what way it is done and how it is regulated. That's actually going to go towards a case called the Vandermark case, and that case pretty much discusses that if the employer is the one that gets to tell somebody how the work is getting done, how they're going to conduct themselves on a work site, what they're going to do specifically in that work site in that day, then it's probably because that person's an employee because they're doing what the employer tells them to do. An independent contractor, on the other hand, they're going to determine how they're going to carry out their job on their own way. They might have to do a few things based on the preference of the employer, but an independent contractor, for the most part, gets to determine like how they're going to carry out the manner of their work. The next question to ask is the daily scope of employment. So, is what is happening within the scope of the normal employment? If it is within the scope of the normal employment, then it's probably going to be more of an employee type situation as opposed to an independent contractor, because an employee comes to work and does the same thing every single day. So if they're doing the same thing every day, it's probably within their scope of their employment. If they're doing something outside the scope of the employment because they chose to do so, or they're asked to do so, or they're hired specifically for this one thing, probably independent contractor, or potentially a detour, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, the last question to ask is what is happening something that is run by the employer on a day-to-day basis? Is the employer in charge of day-to-day operations? That's known as the Humble Oil test. It comes from the Humble Oil case. And pretty much what they're asking is, who is in charge of everything that happens every single day, Monday through Friday? Who gets to determine and control things? Who's paying the bills? Who's making the schedules? Who is that person? If that person is the person that is doing the work, it's probably independent contractor, it's probably not an employee. If it's not the employee, if it's obviously the employer, then it's probably a master-servant relationship. So a master-servant relationship, if the employee, the employer or the corporation is benefiting, if the way someone does their job is based on what the employer or the boss tells them, if the scope of their employment is always the same job, and if the day-to-day operations are not governed by the employee, by their boss, then it's probably going to be a master-servant relationship. And the reason it's important to determine whether it is a master-servant relationship is if it is a master-servant relationship or employer-employee relationship, then any torts or liability that arise from whatever is happening in this relationship, in this fact pattern, the master or employer will be held liable under vicarious liability doctrine for what they do, because of the doctrine of respondent superior, which says any liability or tort that occurs within the scope of employment will essentially be attached to the employer, and they will be held liable for the acts of their employees. And that's even the case if they are acting not within the scope of their employment. So typically they have to be within the scope of their employment, but there's two things that can happen. They could have what's called a detour or a frolic. A detour is where the employee is completely off the rails, nothing within the job scope, everything is completely separate. He's not acting within his scope of employment at all. And then you have a frolic, which is where the employee is kind of ditzing around, maybe screwing around, or maybe he's on a lunch break or something, but he's still technically, doing his job, or it's tangentially related to his job. If you can argue that, yeah, he might be doing this, but he's still technically at work or still technically part of the job, then it's probably more of a frolic. So they will still be held liable for frolics, but not detours. Lastly, you have to look specifically at torts. So torts liability is going to be also governed by an additional test known as the Bushy test. And that test asks two questions: whether what happened, say in the context specifically of tort, if that was foreseeable, like could the employer have foreseen that this could have happened? And then they have to ask if the action that the employee is taking, if this is something that would not be typically seen in the community, this is not an ordinary thing that happens in the community, if this is a foreseeable issue that could happen, and this action is not typically seen or done within the community, then it passes the Bushy test, and then the employer would be held liable for torts. Now, typically they are held vicariously liable for most torts, but when you're looking at certain torts, like think of like assault and battery, the employer can't be held liable for something like that unless it meets the Bushy test, and that's where that comes in. Now, additionally, independent contractors, the employer would not be held liable for them because they hire them. The only exception to that is if what the independent contractor is doing is considered what is known as an inherently dangerous activity. Those activities, no matter how trained and skilled you are, is still inherently dangerous. Therefore, if something goes wrong, they would still be held liable. That's just kind of an overall doctrine. This is how this works. This is typically, going to be used in agency law, but even if it doesn't, the reason they teach them together is because technically it's like it is essentially an agent principal type relationship, but agency law developed more into employer liability over time. So doubtful you'd need to know, but just in case, now you do. Hope it wasn't too fast.